Hello, good morning, and welcome to our global audience. My name is Tamsin Rose, a Senior Fellow at Friends of Europe think tank in Brussels. Welcome to our conversation. This strategic conversation is the first that we're having on health in a series of new types of conversations that Friends of Europe is launching, where we ask leading policymakers to share their views on key issues. And this morning, I'm delighted to welcome Marc van Ranst, who is perhaps familiar to many of you if you've been watching the Belgian conversation about COVID-19. You're a virologist, an epidemiologist based at the Catholic University of Leuven, and you've been working on this for a long time. You've had responsibility for leading the preparedness for a flu pandemic since 2007, and currently you're advising the Belgian government both on its response to COVID, and you're a member of the group of experts for the exit strategy. And as I speak to you now from Brussels, we're slowly starting to open up the lockdown process that's been designed to reduce and flatten the curve. And this morning, we're going to be talking about the issue of a vaccine and what that might mean and how this might be rolled out. So welcome, Marc, to our audience.
Good morning.
I'd just like to say that people can participate by sending questions and comments via Twitter. Please use the hashtag FOE debate for Friends of Europe debate. Let me just start, Marc, by asking you the first key question, which is everyone's waiting for a vaccine. We've seen unprecedented amounts of money and effort being put into vaccine development. We've seen companies work together, universities, governments. So there's an enormous global effort working towards a vaccine. But what can we do to make sure that what is a global effort actually results in global access? Because increasingly we see in the media stories of some countries saying, well, our population first, if we help to develop it, we help to pay for it, etc. So how can this amazing global effort actually results in access to everyone? Marc.
I think there, and that was the same in 2009 with the Mexican flu, that the pharmaceutical companies will be the ones that will keep this whole thing honest and fair. They're producing or they will be producing the vaccines, and they are engaging in conversation with governments to stockpile vaccines, to basically sort of prepay a couple of million vaccines that they want to purchase for their populations. Of course, every country would want to have the first vaccines, and if possible, all of them at once, immediately when it becomes available. Of course, that will be impossible. So I think companies will do two things. First of all, they will divide the available vaccine basically based on the size of the country, so that all countries that are enrolling in the program will have equal or equitable access to the vaccine. The vaccine will not be available in enormous amounts from day one. It will be gradual, but you want to use the first doses in the most appropriate way, which means that every country will be able to vaccinate their risk groups, or to vaccinate first the ones that are at the highest risk. It would be good if in Europe we could all agree on the prioritization as a Europe and not in the individual countries. That would greatly help. Because if in one country they're going to vaccinate first the elderly, and in the other country they're going to first vaccinate the healthcare workers, or I don't know, the army, the police, then we will create havoc, and every country will basically be criticized for whatever they decide. Bad luck is that we still have time to debate about this. If we can come to some European agreement on prioritization, that would be helpful. So the companies will release vaccines not based on who pays the most, or who pushes the hardest, or the country where the manufacturing plant is situated, hopefully, but will redivide it based on the need and based on the size of the population that needs to be vaccinated. The second thing by which they will keep the operation honest and fair is that hopefully they will use, and they've used that in the past too, and some companies use it in peacetime too, the principle of tiered pricing, where we pay a little bit more so that developing countries can get this at a lower price that also they can afford. So that's the way it probably will go. However, if some countries say, okay, your production plant is in our country, everything you produce is for us, that would be a disaster. That would be a complete failure of Europe. That would also not be easily forgotten. The reason that companies do this or want to do this in a fair way is that they realize full well that there will be a future after the pandemic, and they will be able to do business with every country after the pandemic. If some countries or some companies are going to do this in another way, that will not easily be forgotten. I mean, your friends, when you're in time of need, are going to be your friends in peacetime too. If you're going to give the middle finger to countries, that will not be forgotten. And companies are afraid of that, and countries should be afraid of that too.
You've spoken, when you talk about this, you're using the sort of language of peacetime and war, and certainly this is being framed very much as a battle between humanity and the virus. And you've talked about the need to be honest and fair, but honest and fair are very subjective ideas, aren't they? Especially if it's your population and you've got an election coming up in the next 12 months. This is the challenge, and in Europe alone, we've got 27 countries with potential elections coming up in the coming years. You advise the Belgian government. How much do you feel they are open to this idea of negotiating at European level, not just at national level, where they'll face the results from their voters, about sharing access to a vaccine if and when it becomes available?
I think even for politicians, it might be a wise idea to do it on the European level, because if they make a national effort and it fails, that will backfire greatly on their political careers. So if they're smart about it, I think they will also go the European way. This will depend much on how strong the European leadership can be in this operation. In the early stages of this pandemic, I think we have to admit that European leadership was not all that great. We seem to be able in Europe to do great things in a concerted way when it has to do, for example, with animal health. That runs relatively smoothly. However, when it comes to human health, we're not the United States of Europe yet.
And as you said, at European level, things were not very pretty when it came to the issue of PPE. We had shortages in some countries, other countries blocking it, passing their territories. So when we looked at the issue of basic protective equipment, that's not even a vaccine, but the things that would protect the key workers, we didn't have a very clear collaboration. Do you think that we've learned from that and things will be better prepared for a vaccine?
I would hope so, because for the vaccine, we still have some time. For the PPEs, it was really every country was in a complete panic. Strategic stocks were not available in many countries, including mine. So everybody was basically trying what they could to really scrambling to get every mask that was available. What was the end result? It was well, due diligence was not done. People were doing business with ill-reputable vendors, and things were not really happening in a proper way. I think we can learn from that.
Yes.
If the vaccine would be available tomorrow, I'm 100% certain that will not happen, since it is still many months from us away from us. That might give us some more time to think about this and create some common wisdom.
Okay. Let's look at the issue of a potential vaccine, because that is the area where people are putting all their hopes. When a vaccine becomes available, we won't be at risk anymore. But in Europe, we've got a bit of a checkered past when it comes to vaccination, and quite historically high levels of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine refusal on existing vaccines, on things like against measles, for example. So if and when a vaccine becomes available, should it be mandatory?
Mm. It's difficult to predict the future because it hasn't happened yet. And some people are extremely good in predicting the past. But in this case, it's quite easy to predict what will happen. In the first phase, a lot will be talked about the vaccine. The vaccine is there. Who will produce it? At what price will we get it? From which company will we buy it? When will it be here? And that will be in a general atmosphere of everybody wants the vaccine. Yeah? That will be the period where if you do not do your prioritization on a European level, in every country there will be a fight. Everybody wants the vaccine first. That is followed by a period where the vaccine is here. How will we organize the campaign? Who will do it? Who will profit from it? And then the discussion will get sour. And then you get a period where the anti-vaxxers will bloom. And they will say, okay, is this vaccine safe? What does your government want to do with you? There will be dead people. And it is completely predictable how it will go. Unfortunately, I don't think making it mandatory will really work. What does the anti-vaccine lobby want? They want you to make it mandatory, because then you validate all their fears, they actually hope that government would make it mandatory. Their membership would rise, their popularity would rise. Let's not give him that pleasure. We cannot make it mandatory for many, many reasons. If I'm a small man, but if you would say you need to be vaccinated and I don't want it, you need more than 2 people to restrain me. So in the end, it doesn't really work all that well. And it puts the governments as a sort of adversary of the population. And it's as if the population or the government does not trust the population. So making it mandatory is a recipe for disaster, I think. However, you should try whatever you can to bring positive messages, the right information. You have to fight the anti-vaxxers, but not too much in public. There's a whole slew of things that can happen, and people understand anti-vaccination sentiments and vaccine hesitancy much better than in the past. I mean, in London, Heidi Larson does tremendous good work on trying to understand what drives people in one or the other direction. So a lot more is known. So I'm a little bit more hopeful that this will work out in a proper way.
But if you look at, for example, the lockdowns, where it was people were advised to do something, but it was backed up with enforcement. There were fines, police were stopping cars, checking where people were going. So because it was such a big behavioral shift and huge impact, we needed this kind of enforcement. And if access to schools or workplaces or public places relies on herd immunity, enough people being vaccinated, is it enough to trust that people will choose to vaccinate themselves?
We can also put it the other way. I mean, these lockdowns were probably the most severe restriction on social life and on our freedoms that we ever had, in probably ever. And during the Second World War, people were allowed to do more than they were now. That went over quite well. There were no revolts. There were some people who were who were crossing the line and did something which was considered inappropriate under the lockdown rules. But was it widespread? Not at all. The curve went down. The willingness of the population to go along with these measures was admirable, was great. So I think that bodes really well for other things. And I don't think the enforcement was the major key there. People were criticizing each other when they crossed the line. There was a lot of willingness to go along with this.
So social pressure and
Yeah,
social norms helped
exactly.
encourage people to follow the rules on lockdown. And we would hope that the same thing would happen
Right.
on vaccination. What happens if a new vaccine arrives and we have high levels of people who don't get vaccinated for whatever reason? Can we achieve herd immunity? What happens if we don't? Is the vaccine then a lost opportunity?
Well, we see that in every year with influenza vaccination. We know influenza for decades. We have a vaccine. It's not the greatest vaccine, but neither might the coronavirus vaccine be the greatest vaccine. There are no guarantees there. A part of the population vaccinates themselves. The older population rather well. Some of the others probably not as much as they should. Um, and we think it's okay. Well, we don't think it's okay, but it happens, and that's the way it is. We do not need 100% vaccination rate. If you get to 60, 70, then that would be great. If you get less than that, then at least you can say, okay, I not only vaccinated myself for the greater good of society, but also for egoistic reasons to protect myself. To the ones that do not want to vaccinate themselves, you can say, well, all right, it's your decision, but at least we'll have free beds on intensive care for you. That's the message that we should bring.
Okay. I mean, I'm glad you brought the conversation back to influenza, because you've been preparing for a flu pandemic since 2007, and I've been hearing the epidemiologists talk for a while that we are due a big pandemic coming back. But COVID has come from the left field. It is both like flu and completely different. What can you tell us about all the work that was done to prepare for flu?
Mm.
How much of that has been useful, and how much are we in completely new territory here?
It's a novel virus, it's a different virus. However, the symptoms are really the early symptoms are quite the same. The risk groups are almost completely the same. Um, the difference is children who are really a driving force in an influenza epidemic really do not seem to play that role for reasons that we do not completely understand yet in COVID-19. When you look at the overall mortality where we are now, we're at about 300,000 people that died. We do not know where it will go. Might go up to 1 million. That would put it in the same range as the Asian flu in 1957 or the Hong Kong flu in 1968. 1 to 2 million people that were dying. We have to keep in mind that the normal seasonal flu that we're completely accustomed to every year kills 250,000 to 500,000 people worldwide. We're not there yet with COVID-19. We'll get there at the 500,000 level, I'm sure. But is it completely out of the same league as the flu? I don't think so either. So it's not the Spanish flu, or at
Okay.
least if a second wave that is catastrophic does not happen, it will not be as lethal or mortal as high as mortality goes as the Spanish flu, and it will resemble probably, yeah, an influenza pandemic, but not the worst one. So yes, you can make that comparison, and people are confused when you do this. When virologists talk about influenza, that's influenza with a capital I. That is something bad. When the population hears the word influenza, they say, it's only influenza. So that we have to make a bit more clear, because that generates confusion in the minds
Yep.
of the population.
There's also been some conversation about the fact that, as you said, the numbers of people who've died globally so far are 300,000, and on a bad season for flu, up to 500,000 may die. And some people are questioning: have we overreacted? Have we essentially willingly destroyed all our economies for something that would have just have killed the same number of people as flu every year?
Right. Well, that's a discussion that you can never win. At the end of the game, there is one certainty, and that is whatever you do, you will be criticized. If it becomes really a big disaster, you didn't do enough. If all is well and it's rather okay, then you did too much. There is no point, there is no number in terms of people dying where people would say, oh, okay, this was an appropriate response. It doesn't exist. Because If you're afraid of the hurt that was done to the economy, well, try to look at the damage that would have been done if we wouldn't have done nothing. People are forgetting about this. People are always forgetting what the danger that has been avoided, and they think that the numbers that we have now are the normal numbers. They're not. These were numbers that were achieved with enormous measures. But all epidemiological models point to, and why wouldn't the virus have increased exponentially? So point to an exponential growth and an exponential death rate with the same or higher damage to the economy that would have been much more long lasting. But I'm fully aware that in the end, whatever you do, criticism will be your due.
That's true. I hope you have a thick skin ready for that, Marc, because I'm sure the criticism will come.
Always.
Let me now pass to you a question that we've had submitted from Debating Europe, which is a project of Friends of Europe aimed at connecting citizens with policy. And this is a question that comes from Matt. He says he's seen reports of UK scientists successfully testing a vaccine for COVID-19 on rats. And he wants to know, how far away are we for a vaccine for humans? What would you tell Matt?
We will, in the coming weeks, hear about successful vaccines. So vaccines that will start to be tested in humans, and we will see antibodies develop. After that, there will be trials, phase 3 trials, where we will look at the real effect of COVID-19. When an antiviral is available, there will be studies, vaccine studies, where people will be willfully infected with COVID-19 to hopefully get it in a mild way, and then in the control group have it averted by the vaccine. You can only do that when you have a efficient antiviral to immediately treat the people, otherwise you can't do that kind of studies. So there will be a lot of positive news. And people will automatically think, oh, they have a vaccine, so in 2 weeks it will be available for 7 billion people. That will not happen. So having a vaccine, designing a vaccine is easy. The vaccines have been designed. The testing in the animal models is going on in many, many laboratories. And for the most part, they will be positive. Most of the viruses that will be tested, most of the vaccines that will be tested will be safe in humans. And then comes the hard part, making 7 billion, or if you need 2 doses, 14 billion doses. That is not happening overnight. We don't have the infrastructure for that. Some of the companies are already producing the vaccine now. They're already producing vaccine. Then probably at the early parts of 2021, we will know the results of the trials. We will have the decisions of the FDA, of the European Medicines Agency that say, okay, we give this vaccine our blessing, and then they will immediately have the vaccine ready to use. They're taking an enormous financial risk there. If the FDA and European Medicine Agency says, nah, it's not good enough, then their production just goes down the drain. So they try to gain us a couple of months, actually probably 6 months, by already producing while the tests and the paperwork is still being dealt with. But even then, all the vaccine will not be available at the same time for everybody. That will create a lot of political, diplomatic, whatever problems that we'll need to face.
Let me ask you a little bit about the potential of a vaccine. Is it likely to be like a flu vaccine, so it would need to be changed every year, or we'd need to have a new injection every year, or is it likely to be a one-off shot that we have for life?
It will be in between. Hopefully, and because the mutation rate, so the rate by which the virus changes, is lower for coronaviruses than for influenza, or at least for this COVID-19 SARS coronavirus type 2. We hope that the vaccine will protect for more than 1 season, but it will not be a one-shot vaccine. After a couple of seasons, the immunity will go down and a new vaccine will probably be needed. It is also highly probable that a first vaccination will need to happen with 2 shots instead of 1. Logistically, that's a nightmare. Cost-wise, it doubles the cost. or almost doubles the cost. But that is likely.
So we're really, as a society, going to have to learn to live with COVID. It's now out into the open, in the wild, and we're going to have to get used to regularly vaccinating, preparing for it, and thinking for it.
That is the most likely scenario. There
Okay.
is a small chance, but that is really small, that COVID-19 just disappears. That it's happened before in 2003 with the SARS epidemic in the province of Guangdong in China, and a couple of cases in some other countries, notably Canada. It disappeared. Beginning of June, the number of cases was extremely small and it completely disappeared. Is this likely to happen? Not really. This is really a pandemic. SARS was only in a couple of countries. This is worldwide. It is more transmissible than SARS. And it's now on both hemispheres. Both the northern and the southern hemisphere have the virus. And when that happens, the chances that a virus like that becomes seasonal is a lot bigger than if you can avoid this.
Let me just ask you to compare this to HIV, where we've spent billions and 30 years trying to find a vaccine, and we still don't have any viable vaccine on the horizon. How is this different? How can we have hope that we are likely to get a vaccine that's workable within the next 18 months?
Okay. Well, first of all, for HIV, I don't think we will hope for a vaccine. We can control this with antivirals. They work well. If we give everybody access to it and we're a little bit smart, then we can eradicate HIV. That is possible. If there would be an HIV vaccine tomorrow, who would you give it to? Would we vaccinate our children against HIV? HIV is pretty avoidable if you're a little bit careful. And it is, so there will be no HIV vaccine. Had it been easier in the early years of the epidemic, definitely when antivirals were not available or not that great yet, then yes, that would have been an option. But HIV is really a moving target. You want to shoot, it moves. It mutates much more rapidly than coronavirus, luckily. So there, I think it's less of a moving target. We can hit it, but only for a couple of years, and then we will need a new vaccine.
Thank you. And one last question to you, Marc, and thank you for sharing your knowledge and insight with us, which is that some countries and organizations are talking about some kind of immunity passport. If you've had it once, then you might be immune for the future. Do we know that? Does that make sense?
It's not going to happen. And at least I would very much hope that it would not happen, because that would be a very dystopic society to live in, where people with green bracelets would be okay and could go to the cinema and whatever, and with the red, you would be prohibited from doing so. That will create to weird behavior. People will falsify this. People will willfully infect them with the virus in order to become green. We don't want to live in a society like that. But even so, it would not work. That vaccine passport or that passport would be okay the first season. You will be able to distinguish who is immune for a while and who's not. With the second wave, it will be complete disaster for the serological assays. Don't put all your stock in the serological assays, because after one season, they will not be able to distinguish between the old and the new antibodies. They will cross-react and it will be a big mess. There is no serological assay for respiratory viruses that is worth its money, really not. So forget about these passports. They will never happen.
Okay. Well, Marc, thank you very much for spending some time with us and answering our questions. And you've given us a lot of things to think about. And the one thing that I've taken from this is not to hold out for a vaccine in the short term, not to think that because someone's been immune that they can not get it again. So we're back to hygiene, physical distancing, remembering the basics of how we spread and being careful in our contacts. So can I say a warm thank you for your time? And I know you're very busy with all the many requirements that you have to help the Belgian government manage this. So my thank you to you for your time. We do have some more strategic conversations coming up. And in a moment, we'll show you on the screen when is the next one that you can participate in. Thank you to everyone who has listened to us live. This will also be recorded and you'll be able to watch it at a later date. To everyone who's watched, stay safe, be careful, wash your hands, and remember, we are the ones who can stop this thing from spreading further. It's our responsibility to flatten the curve. So thank you, Marc. And we may come back to you again in the future as this thing evolves. Thank you to our global audiences, and goodbye.
Bye now.